What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Lonely Wrist. Today, of course, Justin is back, and my brother Cameron from Craft and Taylor. What's up, buddy?
Hey
What's going on,
guys,
Cam?
thanks for having me.
It's been a long time coming. We've been trying to get you on, man.
Yeah, I've been a busy boy. Been traveling a lot, and I'm finally in one place for, I guess now it's been a week and a half, which is even weirder sometimes than being on the road for extended periods of time. But yep, back here in LA for a minute, and honor to be on the pod, man. This is really cool.
You're
Yeah, yeah.
practically you're practically the musician of the watch industry. Is that how it works? You're having to travel
Kind of,
around.
yeah. It's funny because we kind of call it like, when we go out on our watch hunting safaris or expeditions, we're kind of in a way like on tour. And I have a few musician friends and clients, and we actually kind of relate because we're always running through airports and in the hotels and, eating weird food and all that kind of stuff. So a little bit, yeah, definitely some similarities there.
That's
I was
awesome.
get I was getting ready to tell Justin the story on how I met you, but then I was like, let me just save this like for the podcast because this is a good story. But
Cool.
I went to the vintage watch show like last year at the Win, and then I had watched a video about like Speedmaster Mark IIs, and I was like, dude, I fucking want one so bad. And then, sure enough, like I'm literally going around asking vendors like for Speedmasters, yada yada yada. Talking to a few people, and then Cameron's standing right next to me, flipping through like some, a little box of like watches that aren't on display. He's like, "Hey man, check me out." Pretty much said something like that, and then sure enough, like when I found the Mark II, and then I got home and I like had like favorited a video on YouTube, it was Cameron's video. So I was
Oh
like,
yeah.
I was like, okay, so I just bumped into the guy that influenced me to buy a Speedmaster Mark II.
You were in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, yeah, you could say
That's
that.
really
That's
cool.
awesome.
And
Yeah, it's
then,
funny how small the world really is, especially in the watch community, right?
Oh yeah.
And traveling as much as I do, that's the thing that I love the most is meeting people that found something that we did helpful or share kind of like the same passion that I do. Because I think doing what I do, it's a little bit crazy sometimes, especially with the amount of travel and kind of putting it all in there. And when I meet with somebody who shares that same passion or obsession, it kind of validates my seemingly borderline insanity. So that's probably one of the best parts of what we get to do is, meet with people who have the same passions that we do. And yeah, so that's totally awesome.
I know it.
You still have your Mark II?
Yeah, hell yeah, I do.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I'm never gonna get rid of it. I sent it off. It's kind of like a Franken Mark II now because I sent it off to get a service, and they put like Luminova hands on it, and then I still got the tritium dial. So like
Cool,
in the
cool.
future, I probably will try and like get
Bring
like
it back to original spec.
yeah. I mean, I like to do that. I know that the watches have like a history, but a part of me taking ownership of that watch is like, forming a new history from it and giving it a new life. So, obviously for the highly desirable stuff, it's really frowned upon to do what I did. But no, dude, I love it. I love it.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting too, right? Because Omega, out of all of the brands, they do have a really cool kind of archive and service side of what they do. And I think, once you take ownership or possession of something, um, I'm a believer that I have to wear it and use it regardless of the price point. And that might be kind of an interesting thought, because some of this stuff is like priceless, right? I think I have an element of uh situational and kind of just environmental awareness, or I'm not going to take a Paul Newman, you know driving around a racetrack, right? I mean, I have, but also at the same time, there is an element of awareness and also functionality that I think needs to come with these pieces. And I think that also, if something doesn't fit the lifestyle of the wrist that it's on, then those watches tend to kind of sit, and that's no fun, right? So I
Right.
think obviously time and place, but the fact that you have the original parts and can bring it back to the original spec, I think is important. And yields an element of I think long-term collectability, if I can say that, especially with some of the vintage pieces for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously I feel like as much as I go in and out and as I go out at night, having loom is a practical part of me owning a watch.
Yeah.
And it's hard to find watches from, the 70s and 60s that still have functional loom. It's nearly
Yeah.
impossible.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so it just kind of was one of those creature comforts that I was like, all right, I'm willing to sacrifice some of this, and I do have the original hands and everything, the original everything, so I could flip
Yeah.
it back whenever I wanted to, which I think is pretty important.
Totally.
I'm curious. So obviously, I know what you are. I know how awesome you are, and I know what you do. But tell everybody else about Craft and Tailored, and give them a little bit of
Sure.
background.
Yeah. So Craft and Tailored is the company that I own and founded. I guess now we're coming up on 8 years. I was a watch collector and an enthusiast before I started the company. I came from the technology space, and I really liked things, whether it be clothing or cars or watches that had an element of exclusivity to them that in some cases also didn't really pertain to the price point. I liked things that had kind of a more bespoke kind of feel to them, or things that had substance behind them versus just being an item of, tangible monetary value or brand, really. So I got a little bit burnt out in the tech world and kind of didn't know what I wanted to do. And over a period of 4 or 5 years before I started Craft and Tailored, I started collecting watches. And through collecting, I was able to, gain a lot of knowledge and insight into, the history of these things and the technical, elements. And also with vintage, there's, specific details that you have to pay attention to, like fonts and, the shape of serial numbers and the range of serial numbers and that kind of stuff. So, sorry, we're in downtown LA, and it's a busy morning for us here. I'm not sure if you can hear the
LA
police.
sounds like a beautiful place.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We love our office, but we're right in the heart of downtown LA, so it's a busy spot.
Yeah.
But through that developing passion, I guess in a way, I started to become very knowledgeable about specific references and specific eras and things like that. And then what ended up happening is I amassed this collection of watches. I would be in these, kind of interesting places all over the country and the world, and I would find watches that were of good value or kind of like, hidden in plain sight. And being an obsessive collector, I would buy these watches, and in some cases I would restore the movements to make sure that they were working or what have you. And this is this is probably now 10, 11 years ago, maybe even longer at this point. But a lot of the knowledge and academics on watches was like barely on the internet. It was in books, it was in old past auction catalogs, it was in that kind of area. And the community at that time was really just kind of like the message boards. It was like Omega forums, it was military watch resource forums, it was vintage Rolex forum, those kind of places. So I really became connected with that community of people because they were enthusiasts just as I was, but maybe some of them had more knowledge and that kind of stuff. So through finding these kind of things hidden in plain sight, I amassed a collection. And then when I left the technology space, I kind of started helping people buy watches and passing on my knowledge. And it wasn't really anything for business or commerce or anything like that. It was really just to be part of the community, which is something that's very important to me still. So I had a good friend that was like, maybe you should do this watch thing as a full-time gig. And I was like,
Yeah.
really? Like, why? And I had amassed this collection of watches, and I kind of started to feel like a hoarder. I think at one time I probably had in my own personal collection like 8 or 9 5513 no date Submariners. And I kind of started to feel a little bit guilty because I have 2 wrists and 2 ankles, right? There's only so many watches I can wear at a given moment in time. So I kind of felt like these things, even though I had found them and kind of in a way, resurrected their existence, I kind of started to feel a little bit guilty because I loved wearing these things so much. And And why do I need redundant and duplicate?
Gatekeeping.
Yeah, and it really wasn't a gatekeeping thing. I was just in a position to where I could find these things and kind of verify and validate them. So I started selling some of the collection, and then as a result of that, had kind of, I guess, built up a bit of a reputation, and then started Craft and Tailored. And at the time when I started it was really just me. I was a guy that probably had anywhere between 5 and 8 watches at any given moment in time, and I had spare time on my hands after leaving technology. And even to this day, I still kind of really can't help myself. If I walk by like a pawn shop or an estate store or whatever, wherever it is in the world, like in some cases, I'll like be late for a dinner meeting or something because I like have to go into that store and make sure that there isn't something there. So fast forward, a few years, we started with a YouTube channel and an Instagram and kind of started leaning into social media. That was something that I guess is just kind of part of our generation, really. It was kind of a native kind of migration into that. And then one of the things that I really wanted to do was share what I knew about these things. So Blake, like, for example, the Speedmaster Mark II video, that was a really cool and interesting watch to me, and I had amassed this knowledge. So why not put that into a video and share my knowledge and maybe give people a little bit of a historical overview or talk about why these watches are cool and important. And that's kind of spun up into what Craft and Tailored is today. So I think we're first and foremost a vintage watch dealer and a curator of those things, but we also manage a good number of very important collections. We have a content element, which is, I would say, more educational, and we talk about things that are relevant to the watch space from a historical and kind of technical perspective. And then we also have the Craft and Tailored Journal, where we've done some collaborations and we're talking about our travels and or interesting things that pertain to horology. And here we are today.
Something that I think was funny is when I was going through looking for my Mark II, like you were talking about like the cases like being molested or something like
Yeah.
that. You're like, make sure the case isn't molested. And I was like, okay, what's molested? Like I was trying to define, because it is like a radiant like sunburst like finish,
Yeah.
which is very unique to the case. And then the chamfers are polished and then brushed on the side again. It's just a very unique case finishing. And yeah, so it's kind of funny. But I'm curious, and talking about as you got going as a collector, like what was your first couple like pieces?
The watch that really started it all for me is a watch that I still really love today. And we talked a little bit about amassing this collection of no-date Submariners. The first watch I ever really kind of fell in love with was, and I had some, smaller, kind of more interesting things, I guess, before I really bought my first Rolex. I still have this watch. It's like a Hamilton khaki field watch, right? Very simple mechanical
Classic
movement, kind of just, that, field watch interpretation through Hamilton. And I had bought a later model that was Swiss made, kind of post, the American watchmaking side of Hamilton. And it was more kind of a modern contemporary piece. But the first watch that I ever bought was this Rolex Submariner reference 5513. It had a meters first dial. It was missing the complete bezel assembly. The crown had, gone lost. And I think what ended up happening is there was like a little jewelry store pawn shop that I would pop into. And I said to the owner of the shop, hey, next time, an old Rolex comes through the door, just give me a call. I want to, doesn't matter what the condition is or whatever. And it just so happened to be that it was this 1967 Rolex 5513 that probably lost the bezel or the crown at some point, and the guy kind of just threw it in the drawer, and there it sat for 25 30 years at that point, right? Or maybe even longer. So I get this watch, and without kind of really knowing what I was getting into, I knew that the watch, I kind of had to verify what it was for myself. And at the time, I think I paid like $750 for this watch. Even by standards back then, I think that 5513s were probably trading for around maybe $5,000. So it was a great deal, but I didn't really have any kind of perspective on, I just kind of took a chance on it and wanted to get involved. And so through kind of learning about this watch, I had to, I learned about, that mark variant of that dial, right? Being that it was a matte dial, it was meters first instead of feet first. I learned why Rolex had that, kind of interesting depth rating presentation. I had to find the correct, Mark III insert. I had to find the correct, twin lock, crown for that era of watch. And that really kind of pulled me into the watch community because, I had to find these parts to basically bring this watch back. And so that was really the tipping point, I think, for me is learning about, the intention behind a lot of these things and the history and the subtle small details that really make these things what they are. And so that was really the first watch that kind of pulled me in. And there was a lesson in that watch for me. I had amassed this collection of Submariners, and as I became a dealer, I started to acquire different things. I was kind of on my collector's journey, I guess. And so there was a point in which I had acquired a watch that was seemingly in better condition, and it had a stronger case and all that kind of stuff. And I ended up selling that watch. And that was probably one of the most regretful sales that I had ever had. At the time, I really didn't think anything of it, but that watch kind of being the first watch and the watch that sparked my passion, I would probably pay like quadruple the price for that watch today just because of the sentimental value of it.
Yeah.
So that's really kind of what pulled me in. I guess I got my start in true vintage horology with the vintage Submariner. And I think the 5513 and the 5512, the no date subs, are kind of one of the most pure interpretations of the Submariner, because obviously with the introduction of the Submariner in the 1950s, the watch didn't possess a date. It kind of had that real pure tool watch kind of feel. And that's a watch that is kind of near and dear to my heart still, even to this day.
Something that I think about.
Go ahead, Blake.
Something I think about a lot is, there's so much misinformation, especially in the watch community, and not having, like, now there's resources out there that are slowly coming to existence that will help people navigate some of these tricky vintage buys. But, we had Perestroika. I'm sure you probably know Jose Perestroika.
Yeah.
He came on. He came on, like, he was like one of our first podcast guests.
Yeah.
And we just deep dived, and just to see how much stuff out there. First of all, there's not enough information. There's no like real like playbook.
Right.
And then there's just so much like, misinformation, misdirection, manipulation, whatever you want to call it, in the vintage watch industry, where people are essentially like refurbishing these and then, using a fake, fake pushers, or like, a fake dial, and then selling it as original. And
yeah,
I can only imagine, in 10 years past, just having to go through and navigate all that.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's a couple of things. One, I guess let me kind of start from the top. One, a lot of these brands that we hold in such high regard today, they either don't have an archive or like a historical kind of like spec of what things are. And I think the reason for that was, if we look at, like, just take Rolex, for example, Rolex was making tool watches. Submariners back in the 1960s were, I think I have an old vintage ad that is for like a sub, and it was like a $215 watch, right? Which is, back in the 60s, not a lot of money, but it's also not like the most expensive thing that you could buy. And I think that, just looking at that one segment of the entire type of wristwatch genealogy within the sub, these things were made to be tools. And I think that what makes them so interesting to collect is the different variants of, say the Submariner or the Day Date or the Daytona or whatever it is, right? But I think that, these subtle changes that we celebrate today weren't in many cases defined as being collectible or rare. It was just a change of the dial. It was the change of the luminous material. I think also in the 1980s and into the 1990s, the collecting mentality has also changed. So in some cases, you'll see a dial that's been refurbished. You'll see a bezel insert that's been changed, whether it was a service bezel, whether the dial was changed for, to make the watch more functional or whatever. I mean, I've even seen watches that have been, reloomed. Really, I don't think with the intent of them being like beautified for an uplift in sale. It was more of a technical thing. Or say a dial, tarnished or generated a patina. If somebody in the 80s or the 90s was selling that, they would want to present the watch, in a better way. So I think in some cases, to kind of maybe expand on this, watches will have these service parts or refinished dials or whatever, with the intent of that not necessarily being like a malice one where somebody's trying to kind of like uplift the value of something, which obviously plays a huge role in the collectible value today. But there also is the other side of that where, and this is, I think, where Jose comes in, where there is an element of malice intent, like any business, especially things that are highly collectible or valuable, where, somebody is, say, optimizing the case or the dial or, doing whatever to uplift the collectability or the awareness of something or to increase value. And I think that comes really with any business. Having been in the business for a long time and having been a collector for a long time, I mean, we've seen it all. We've seen, things that in some cases are also just unexplainable, right? Like, I have a Patek Philippe right now. It's a Tasti Tondi. So a really, interesting and highly collectible Patek Philippe chronograph out of, this one I think is out of the mid 1960s. And what's interesting about this watch is it came from the estate of a now deceased owner. The dial actually predates the existence of the watch, but the dial is authentic. I've had a bunch of other peers and experts look at the dial, and the dial is authentic. So how do you explain an earlier dial in a later case? Well, the most plausible explanation is, maybe say in the 80s or whenever, right? In somewhere in the watch's history, somebody probably had two of them. One of them had a better, more pleasing dial, and they took that dial out and optimized that case. And whether that intent was of malice or not is something that I don't know. That's the only plausible explanation that I can see for that earlier dial being in a later case. But it's a hard watch now to sell, or I have to kind of go back to the consignor of that piece and say, hey, listen, here's kind of the situation. This is what I think happened. I can't be for sure. The dial is authentic. The case is authentic. It has an extract of the archives from Patek Philippe, but by technical collector standards, this is incorrect. So yeah, to answer your question, I think like anything, you have to be careful. I think you have to do your due diligence. There's guys out there like me, like Jose, like anybody that have a specific area of expertise that you can, of course, leverage. And then I think there's the other side of the coin, which is there's a lot of misinformation, and then there's a lot of people that think that something is true, and this is the gospel, and this is the way that it is. And it's like, but wait, where did you get that information, and why do you think that is the gospel? And I think that that's a really interesting facet of the collecting community, whether it be cars or art, or in this case, watches, where in some cases, there's a lot of internet savants that don't have hands-on experience with this stuff, or are just kind of going off of what everybody else is saying. And there's a lot of new information that's coming to light that is now being deemed as factual and quote unquote gospel that previously wasn't. We see that a lot with Patek Philippe, where in some instances there is like this kind of transitional period, or with like Rolex, for example, with the small crown Submariners, there are, dials in later 60s era cases that Rolex just had a surplus of them. They put them together and they sold them because, Rolex was like, we're sitting on these cases, we're sitting on these dials, let's make a more economical version and move this product. So that's the interesting and fun element of the watch community, where I'm still learning. I think the watch world would consider me an expert, but I'll be the first one to tell you that I'm still learning things. I'm still seeing things. And there's a lot of information out there that isn't necessarily factual because one person or another said it to be true. So yeah, it's kind of an interesting world, especially dealing with high end vintage watches for sure.
Definitely. I'll switch his gears real quick if that's okay, Cameron.
Yeah,
I'm really curious because I know that you've mentioned to the, us to the people that, of course, you guys get to travel the world and kind of, curate and locate these watches.
yeah.
Can you give us a little insight into the process of kind of what that's like to search for these vintage watches around the world? And are there any particular, maybe regions or countries that are just, treasure troves for, these vintage watches?
Yeah, for sure. One thing is that I started traveling for things like auctions or for specific client meetings and that kind of stuff. And when I found myself in these specific areas of wherever, the first thing that I do is Google vintage watch shops or whatever, right? And in some parts of the world, for example, like Hong Kong or Japan, I was finding that there was community there. There were enthusiasts, especially having things like Instagram and Facebook and YouTube and all these
Right.
other things at our disposal. I knew that there was a community there, but there wasn't kind of this defined overview or guide of where to go to kind of find this stuff. So one of the things that I really wanted to do is as I started traveling more, I wanted to kind of keep a reference point of who had what types of watches and maybe not gatekeep that stuff as much, but really ultimately kind of share that with the community. So, I was traveling to Europe a lot. I was traveling to Asia a lot for various watch shows and antique shows and other meetings and stuff. And I kind of had this like wild hair up my butt to, to put this stuff all together. And so the first guide that we did was the Hong Kong vintage watch buyers guide. And as we had gone to these areas on multiple occasions, we kind of knew where to find this stuff. And so we put together these guides, which would at least give people a starting point and also serve as maybe like a validated reference point of, hey, I as Cam, I as Craft and Taylor have been to this shop. I know who's running it. This is the type of watches that they typically have in Curate. I physically have been there, and this is a great starting point. So we started with Hong Kong, then we did Tokyo, we've done Paris. We're going to be doing Italy, probably Rome and Milan. I
Awesome.
definitely want to do more European countries, London. So now people are kind of using these guides as at least a jump off point for where to go to find this stuff. And that's kind of, I think, what started all that. I think, the other thing for me is I'm always about the hunt, right? I love finding this stuff and going into these different areas of the world. Typically there's some kind of, anchor reason for me to be there. It will be like either like a big antique show or a big watch show. And I think the other thing to consider is that when we're on the internet, when we're on Instagram, we're looking at whatever it is that we have a specific interest in. But different watches were popular at different times during different eras in different parts of the world. And these other parts of the world have different options. Especially in areas like Hong Kong and Tokyo, I'm finding a lot of really interesting watches that I really can't get here in the United States. The other thing I would say is that in the United States, everything is really spread out. You realize very quickly when you start traveling, I would say, at least for me, more internationally, how big the United States is.
Yeah.
We're in LA, California, but you could drive from San Diego for 10 hours and not be out of California, right? You can drive across the country and be in the car for another 8 hours and be in the same state. Texas is a big flat place, right? So, in the U.S., there's these little kind of specialists scattered throughout a very big landmass where, for example, in Japan or Hong Kong or in Europe, these countries are a lot smaller, so you have a denser, higher concentration of watches. So one of the great things for us is we're always looking to buy, we're always looking to source. I'm in that kind of perpetual mode of hunting. But when I go to Hong Kong or Japan, there's a higher concentration of the things that I'm interested in, and we can kind of cover a lot more ground, quicker and have a variance in what it is ultimately that we're looking at.
Yeah, I purchased. There's a period of my life which is kind of how I found you, and I'm most interested in your story. where I was kind of like getting little parts of watches and like doing research and trying to assemble an accurate reference. Where I would buy like a movement, make sure I found a great dial, or sometimes when you'd buy the
Sure.
movement and the dial, I wasn't doing this for resale. I was just doing this for fun. It was just an interesting, fun hobby. Of course, I'm not a watchmaker, so I had to find a watchmaker. But I found a vintage Zenith caliber with a dial, and then everything was running perfectly. And then I was in Istanbul, and I literally reached out to somebody on Instagram, and I said like it was like vintage watch collector Istanbul or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, he was like, "Oh." I was like, "Hey, I need this case. Like, I could never find this case anywhere in the United States." But I texted him the case, and I was like skeptical, like, and he found that case for me.
In
Um,
Istanbul.
and it was like, so the movement in this came from like, I think I got it from like Ukraine, but it came from Russia, and then it came to Ukraine, and I had a guy in Ukraine that was just going to the markets in Ukraine, because what people will do is like, they'll just throw out their watches, and you get a
At
lot
like a
of
flea market.
vintage. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways, it all came together in the weirdest way, and it feels so rewarding once you like, as a collector, you pull this watch together, and then you get it on wrist, and it starts running. There's something that like you can't ever compare that feeling to anything else in life. I know it's a lot different to what you do, but as a collector, it's just something that I used as a fun little way, to make watch collecting interesting, because it can be so boring, right? As a watch collector,
100%.
in the weirdest way. Um, but I'm curious as to what was your most memorable find, like,
Oh
in
man.
history.
It's they're all kind of bittersweet. I'll start off by saying that because for me, a find in many cases doesn't really have anything to do with like the value of the watch, in
Sure.
terms of its tangible value. I mean, I've unearthed some things that are like these priceless artifacts, with a ton of provenance and history and that kind of stuff, right? Um, I think that there's been a good number of them. I think the thing that is like the most fun for me is like finding things in really unexpected places. One of the most memorable, I think, recent finds is a watch that ended up in my personal collection. Um, Tyler Vanes, who is my cousin, our moms are our sisters, who's the vice president of Craft and Tailored, joined the business, I think, at the end of year one or year two, as we started to kind of expand the business, and I just needed help. Knew really nothing about watches at the time, and now I would consider him a peer, and definitely in the top tier of experts in the world on horology, just through this 8 years of like drinking from the fire hose, right? And through his experiences. But Tyler and I were in Japan, and there's this really cool mall in Japan. It's called Nakano Broadway, and there's a couple of bigger dealers in this kind of like arcade mall. Jack Road is one of them. There's like a bunch of different like little watch shops. So this was, I think, this was probably our first trip to Tokyo together. And, this mall is like a really interesting place. It has kind of everything in the mall. There's like a whole floor dedicated to comic books. Then there's a whole floor dedicated to like Transformer figurines, and then there's a whole floor that's dedicated to like vintage dolls, and it's just like this weird eclectic like mall of collectibles. And it's very bright, and there's like these little like kind of hidden corners where you'll turn a corner and there's like this like 80s Atari collecting gaming corner. It's like a
That's
really
so
fun
cool.
and interesting place. Yeah. And so we kind of made our way through the mall, and really didn't find anything. And we're on our way out, and there's kind of this shop that wasn't a dedicated watch shop. It was kind of like something you would probably find similar to like maybe Europe or maybe even the US, where it was kind of like an antique store where there were like these glass cases. But I think, there were different people who owned the cases, and this guy kind of was facilitating the shop filled with just, I would say, kind of like weird junk. It
Okay.
wasn't really, there's a curation and there's kind of a level to it, but it was like fountain pens, ashtrays, weird signs, old Barbies, like just kind of an eclectic mix of stuff. And we're walking by, and I got like this weird feeling, and that's something that I've really kind of tuned into. I'm not really a hippie woo woo kind of dude. I'm not, monitoring the moon cycle and putting my crystals out to charge them. I'm not that guy. But I kind of had this like weird, like magnetic feeling. And so I'm kind of like going into the shop. And I think at the time we had like a dinner reservation or something, and we were burnt out, crazy jet lag. Tyler's looking at me like, bro, there's not gonna be anything in here. Let's go. Right. Our feet hurt. We're tired. And I'm like, just give me a second. Just give me a second. So I walk in, I kind of start looking through the cases. And then in the back corner of this shop, I noticed this, like old Rolex, like watchmaker sign. It was like Rolex watches sold here, service and repair. And so like, a moth to a bright light bulb in darkness. I'm like beelining it towards this case.
You
right?
could smell it just sitting back there somewhere.
I just had this feeling, right? And so I like beelined it to the case, and this sign was incredible. And it was probably from like the late 50s or 60s, like this really interesting and cool sign, which we of course had to have. And Tyler lugged this thing back from Tokyo in his suitcase. But then what happened is in this little case, we started finding other like vintage watch ephemera, which is something that I also love collecting. I collect the old JLC clocks and signs and old advertisements and Rolex ashtrays and Rolex coasters and Omega stuff and whatever. So we kind of found some of this like cool ephemera. We got like this like Omega Zippo that was like new old stock. We bought just a bunch of cool little accessories and of course this sign. So we're taking the stuff up to the front to kind of pay for it, and the guy didn't really speak English. He was talking to us in Japanese, and we're kind of using Google Translate to communicate and stuff. And he goes, "Well, do you guys like watches?" And we're like, "Yeah, of course." And he's like, "Oh, let me take you to this back case." So he takes us to this back case, and there's a bunch of like really odd and kind of weird watches. There was some like Citizens and some cool Seikos, and then there was 2 Tudor watches, and one of them was a Tudor No Date Submariner Snowflake black dial, and this watch was just like, perfect case. It showed honest patina and wear, unpolished on its original bracelet. The black dial didn't show any degradation. And I'm like, we're in the most random spot, right? So we ended up acquiring that watch for kind of a good deal in terms of price, but the condition was there and it was definitely a find. And I kind of put this watch on my wrist, not really with the intention of keeping it, but throughout the rest of that trip, I had traveled from Tokyo to Kyoto and spent some time in Kyoto. I kind of just started wearing this watch and fell in love with it. And that ended up kind of being a watch that just really never made it into the sales section of our vault. It kind of just ended up on my wrist, or I'd like hide it in my own personal watch roll or whatever. And so this watch kind of then started traveling with me and kind of became this, marker for this experience with, Tyler, who is, my cousin, but also one of my best friends for this time that we were in Tokyo together. And I would say that was kind of one of the more memorable recent finds. It's not, unearthed Big Crown or Paul Newman or anything like that. It's this, simple No Date Snowflake Tudor sub, but that watch is, meant everything to me, and it's a watch I wear a lot. And I'm learning in my later collecting that in a lot of cases it's not necessarily about the value or the ultimate collectability of things. Sure, I have those things in my collection, but this Tudor Snowflake is kind of like that watch that marks a specific moment in time and kind of reminds me to just like keep pushing even though we're jet lagged and tired. Maybe just go into the one more shop or maybe keep going, because you just literally never know what you're going to find or where you're going to find it.
I love how everybody always has their own personal stories that are kind of attached to watches and where they were at in their lifetime, or, what was happening in that specific moment. I'm the same way, especially with music and things like that. You hear a song and you're like, oh, this brings me back to a certain time. But,
Yeah.
I have the same thing with watches. I love that story. That's really cool. I'm curious, how do you guys assess and authenticate a lot of these vintage watches that you guys find? And, what are some of those key things that you look for?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, so I think we definitely carry tools with us that allow us to inspect watches and authenticate them. I would say the first thing is, I'm reading books still, right? I'm collecting books. I'm on the internet all the time. I'm, going to the auction previews and previewing things and assessing things and all that kind of stuff. I've been a member and invited to a bunch of gatherings, like Rolly Fest in New York, the VRA, Vintage Rolex Asylum, get together in Indonesia, and some of those types of meetings. Obviously, I love the social element and meeting people and sharing the passion, but in some of those instances, I'm able to see a lot of the world's best watches, and I'm analyzing them and increasing my experience and my hands-on with a lot of this stuff. So I think the one thing that allows us to do that quite well is just having done this for so long and looking for consistencies, and in some cases looking for flaws in things that are known to be kind of a maker's mark, so to speak. I always have a loop on me. I always have ultraviolet light on me. When we're traveling to countries, we also carry things like a Geiger counter because
Oh, wow.
Rolex and some of the watch makers at the time were using
Radiation.
radioactive lume, which is a good tell on things. So I'm looking at those things, and I think there's definitely had a really interesting conversation with a collector the other day. I'm probably looking at things that most people, they don't even know exist or care to know exist, like the mark variations of a dial, and does that mark variant match the serial production run for those known watches? Is the tritium lume consistency or the radium or whatever, does that match that production period? There's like this kind of like index in my brain, that I'm always trying to refresh and keep sharp, that allows us to make successful and proper buys. In some cases too, I've come across things where I don't know 100%, but I'm using all of that kind of accumulated knowledge, and I'm looking at like the way a dial was printed or the way a case is finished to kind of use my best judgment in buying some of these things. Some of the stuff too is also definitely much more known, like for example with Patek Philippe or Rolex or whatever. In many cases, there's kind of a standard or kind of that, again, those maker's marks that we're looking for. But
Right.
some of the stuff that's like more piece unique, or maybe there's not as much information or knowledge. A lot of it is using the tools that I have with me, and sometimes doing a quick Google, sometimes trolling Instagram and seeing if I can find somebody that has that specific variant, because there have been cases where I've found things that they're like hen's teeth. There's so few of them that the reference points of that example are so far and few between. So I'm using kind of a mixture of those things to help validate, help verify. But I think a lot of the things that allow us to successfully find watches and bring them to market or add them into our own personal collection, are a ton of experience, a ton of academia relating to learning from other people and reading literal books, looking at old auction catalogs from like the 80s and the 90s, where I'm looking at pictures and that kind of stuff to always increase my knowledge and use as a reference point, even when on the road.
How do you feel like the market for vintage watches has evolved over the years, and like where do you see it heading?
That's a great question. I mean, I think like any market, and I think we're in an interesting time and place for watches as a whole. I think any market is going to have its ups and downs, and I don't think it would be a market if it didn't. A market can't always be doing this, and a market can't always be doing this, right? A market ebbs and flows, and tastes change, and all that kind of stuff. I think the vintage market, I think the one thing that is interesting about vintage watches as a whole is if you look at the way that things were made in the 40s, 50s, 60s, et cetera, really up until kind of the early, 2000s, late 90s, is things were much more handmade, movement production and things like that. There was a lot of hand finishing, and that obviously takes time. Where today watches are being produced in a much more of a mechanized fashion. Things are being cut with laser, and they're being, milled in a certain way with machines and that kind of stuff, which obviously yields an increased production of those things because we're using technology to make basically everything. I think there's some similarity maybe to the vintage car market too, where at those specific periods and times, there's only so much of this stuff, and there's only so many survivors, which kind of yields an element of collectability. I think overall, factoring those things in, I think that you'll see these antiques and these kinds of things always retain some collectible value. I think trending will definitely change. I'm seeing a lot more people, myself included, move outside of, say, vintage Rolex or Omega or Audemars Piguet and get into brands that are maybe just different. A watch that I recently found and added in my personal collection is this
Oh, cool.
early Franck Muller master calendar. And I've been studying Franck Muller and his kind of earlier creations and learning about him as a watchmaker, more recently. This specific watch is really interesting because it's a master calendar, but it has Roman numerals on a guilloche dial. And there's very few of
It's
these.
beautiful.
They were only produced in the later part of the 1980s. I think he started Franck Muller in 89. And I think this is either a 93 or a 94, so pretty early in the Franck Muller production. But I think people are also looking at different things, right? I think Cartier is an example of that. Breguet is an example of that. There's other watches, maybe even within these bigger brands like Audemars Piguet or Rolex that people are looking into. I think also size trending is kind of playing a role into what people are wearing. Watches that have integrated bracelets that obviously are not as easy to wear, or maybe now more socially or fashionable today. Maybe socially acceptable or fashionably acceptable, if I can say that. So I'm seeing trending change, and that's a really interesting thing to kind of observe and also be a part of. I never thought I would be obsessed with Franck Muller, but as I learn more about the brand and him as a watchmaker and some of that early stuff, I'm going like Franck Muller obsessed. I'm really trying to find some of these early references where he's doing things that are interesting from a complications perspective, and the case finishing is different and that kind of stuff. Where today you look at Franck Muller, like, what is this, RM clone that you guys are creating, right?
Yeah.
Deviation from the original part of the brand. So
I know you acquire a lot of Rolex, like Patek, like Vacheron, and Cartier is like
yeah.
your baby. And then of course Omega. But are there any brands that like you just like say, hey, I will not touch that?
Some of the I like, RM. I like the AP like piece unique kind of weirdo stuff. I think that those watches are really interesting for sure. I think the value that watches like that bring is they're really pushing the boundaries of modern watchmaking. They're really on the cutting edge of doing things with materials and machining and things that I think are crazy. Would I ever own, an Hublot? Probably not. Would I ever own like a Rainbow Daytona? No, probably not for me. Do I think that they're interesting watches? 100%. I mean, you look at the gem set bezel of a Rainbow Daytona and that gradient. There's nothing on the planet that quite can capture that. Rolex is really figuring that out. And I think some of these pieces are to be viewed as more artisanal or art pieces, instead of being something that has like an element of functionality. I think for me personally, you'll see a lot of watches on Craft and Tailored and kind of in our curation that we personally love. And that's kind of the element of it being bittersweet. Going back to the Tudor story, that's a watch that ended up in my personal collection because I kind of had developed this sentimental kind of connection with it. But it's a hard business for me because I find things that I have to sell. I've got to keep the lights on. We want to grow as a business, and sometimes they're really hard to sell. A perfect example of this is we recently found a really nice reference 1016 in Tokyo. And we were doing like this video of it, and it was kind of like almost like a live response or kind of an overview of what we had found for the day or the past couple of days. And I think I kind of like under my breath said like, shit, this one's better than mine. Like, I kind of want to keep this one in a weird way, right? But I couldn't because I, again, had that sentimental connection with my 1016, my Explorer one. And It's funny. I was talking with a client about it, and I said, listen, like, I literally, this is better than the one that sits on my wrist and is in my personal collection. And it's kind of a bittersweet thing. I'm happy to pass that on to the next collector, and to be able to facilitate that and kind of dig through all the muck and mire to find these things. But also at the same time, it's like, man, I don't know when I'm going to find another one like this, or this one's better
Yeah.
than mine. So it's kind of
That's
a
that's
bittersweet.
tough because you just have to sit there and accept it at that point. Like, well, but like you said, you've got a personal connection with yours. That'll lead me into my next question. Do you have any personal favorite watches or styles that you've come across,
In terms of
other
like,
than the Tudor, of course?
yeah, no, the Tudor is a cool watch. Yeah, I mean, I like watches, and I think going back to kind of the curated collection of what we bring in, everything outside of really the ladies pieces, because I can't wear like a 26 millimeter, date just. It just would look weird on me.
I can't even read those, honestly. I'm like,
Yeah.
what is
Yeah,
that?
but I think we kind of buy and curate what it is that we personally like. Very rarely do we buy on just value, and I think that that's an element that is hard for the beginning collector to really understand. In some cases, the value is in the condition or the uniqueness of that piece. But you'll see, like on Craft and Tailored, we don't really have a lot of two-tone subs. It's not that I hate them. I just personally probably wouldn't wear one myself. And so that's why we just haven't had a lot of them, because
Yeah.
it's not something that I would personally wear or have an affinity towards. I think going back to that, a lot of the stuff that we bring in is stuff that we would wear ourselves. We're kind of buying with passion and kind of attention to those types of details. As it relates to the personal collection, I kind of ebb and flow. I wrote an article, kind of like a love letter to the three pieces that I wore the most last year. I wore that Tudor Submariner. I wore my 1016 a lot, and I wore an early Cartier, Tank Louis Cartier Extra Plat, and it's their kind of extra thin Cartier tank. It's in yellow gold. It's on its original deployant strap. Those are probably the watches in the collection that get the most wear. I've been wearing this Franck Mueller a lot. I have this really amazing like Breguet Pebble from the 1970s, which is really cool. It's on the smaller side. But there's a bunch of stuff. I mean, I've got subs and all kinds of things, but I don't know. It kind of depends on my mood and what I'm doing. I think it kind of also goes back into the cars I drive too. I think that these things are vehicles to transport us into maybe a different time or place. It's not. I don't want to be Steve McQueen. I don't want to be Robert Redford. I'm not, wanting to put on that costume. But I think that when you put a specific watch on your wrist in the morning, or when you drive a certain car or something like that, for me personally, it changes the way that I feel about myself, and it is kind of like a vehicle to adjust my reality. So. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question necessarily, but
Definitely. It's a good way of putting it. Appreciate
Well,
that, man.
what advice would you give to somebody looking to start purchasing and collecting their own vintage watches? I mean, obviously they can go and kind of go straight to you,
yeah,
um, but for people that are maybe looking for a little bit more thrill and excitement,
like to try to like hunt out their own stuff.
yeah. I mean, or just collecting in general. I know this is a really subjective question, and you ask this question to every other person, you're going to get a different answer. Um, but if you could reach out to, because a lot of our listeners are not vintage collectors, and we
Yeah,
knew we had to have you on because I think a lot of people are intimidated to get into the vintage space. Um, so yeah.
yeah, it is a scary place. I think the first thing would my first element of advice would be to research the heck out of what it is that you're interested in. I think there's this element of, can you find a great deal out there? Can you find these hidden treasures like laying on the surface of the earth? Absolutely, 100%. But to do that correctly, I think requires a lot of knowledge and time and patience. And I think the one thing I would say is take your time. Do your due diligence. Reach out to the community. I answer as many questions as I can on people looking for more information. It's gotten a little bit crazy because our social media following has definitely increased over the past 5 years, and we're getting a lot of emails and all that kind of stuff. But I try to answer as many questions as possible as it pertains to acquiring knowledge, and or also trying to put this stuff out there that gives people knowledge. So I would say the first thing I would say is, take your time, do your due diligence, reach out to the community. If you like something or are inspired by something, learn about it before you maybe jump into the pool. And I think the other thing too is the value, even the monetary value in the cost savings of you taking that time to do the research and or to ask experts. It's not just me. There's a whole network of experts and trusted dealers out there that are just as obsessed with this stuff as I am, that in some cases will give you the time and they'll help you out. So I would say that's maybe my biggest piece of advice is take your time, do research, and don't be afraid to ask. What's the worst thing that can happen? Somebody doesn't respond to your DM or your email, or they tell you to go F off. Like, okay, those probably aren't people that you want to work with anyways, right? And I'm in that same position a lot. If I come across something that I'm not super sharp on, or if I have never seen it before, I always reach out to my peer network. I'm always the guy that's just sending a blind DM. Hey, I found this. You seem to have one. I'm looking to learn or gather more information. Can you help me out? Right.
There's nothing wrong with that, because everybody specializes in something different. And more likely than not, there are people out there that have an abundance of that information. I mean, essentially how Pawn Stars made it. I mean, they did the same thing. They invite these experts in to help relate this knowledge to these products. And I mean, nobody's perfect, and like you said, you can be an encyclopedia for the most part, but you're collecting that knowledge over time. So there's nothing wrong with reaching out to people.
Yeah. The thing I've learned too about working with some of the top collectors in the entire world is all those guys and gals are still learning. We're all still learning. It's like we're looking back over hundreds of years in some cases, and it's like, there was no internet then. There was like this
Right.
old crusty dusty book that like has like the information about these watches, and it's like some of this stuff is not readily available. And also, just
Right.
because the internet says it so doesn't mean that that's ultimately true. So I think take it with a grain of salt too. And I think that would probably be my biggest piece of advice, and is get involved with the community, reach out. I know, Blake, you are always involved in the community. You're always at the events, and you're doing all that kind of stuff. And I really relate to that. Even though I'm a bit busier now than say a couple of years ago, I still try to get into those things because I love meeting with people. I love being inspired by other people. There's a great collector. His Instagram handle is Ronnie Mondavi, and he collects these interesting pieces. These really, Cartier, Patek, all kinds of stuff. And he actually has a brigade that is very similar to the one that I just acquired for myself. And I saw him post it, and that really inspired me to try to find one of these brigades. And when one popped up, I snapped it up. I seemingly overpaid for it. I didn't like hit a home run on the watch or anything like that. And it's a watch that's in my personal collection now, but it was a kind of a direct inspiration from another collector. It wasn't something that like I had discovered or whatever. I saw him post it. I'm like, wow, that's really cool and interesting. And then when I saw one come up, I got it for myself. So yeah.
That's awesome. Are there any emerging trends in the world of vintage watches that I would say like enthusiasts should be aware of?
Are you talking more about like things that are increasing in popularity, or are you talking about maybe
Correct.
something that's still under the radar that people aren't paying attention to?
Yeah, I guess whatever is maybe more or less of people not paying attention to that you've been seeing a lot of that you could kind of just make people aware of.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is quite interesting in the world of vintage watches is that in many cases there were a lot more partnerships and collaborations that happened than today. For example, Rolex today is making their own dials, they're making their own cases, they're doing all this kind of stuff. Where back in the day, there were these small little kind of villages, I guess, or little towns in the Valju Valley that were kind of contributing to the greater watchmaking, industry. So, for example, I recently found a vertical gondole, which is a really interesting Cartier reference.
Yeah.
It's kind of this cushion shape. It's kind of this oversized, very 70s looking watch. And when I was in Hong Kong, I found an Ebel version of the gondole. At first, I looked at it and I'm like, that's got to be a Cartier. But that led me to discover that Ebel was creating a lot of the cases and all that stuff for Cartier in the 1970s. So I found this Ebel version of the gondole vertical jumbo, and that led me down this crazy rabbit hole to start looking at Ebel watches from the later part of the 1970s, because people are, kind of getting into the Cartier stuff a little bit more. But if you peel back the layer of that onion a little bit more, you'll realize that Cartier was working alongside of these other partners to kind of create their product, and in a way, kind of white labeling this stuff. So I found kind of the precursor to that entire reference range, which is highly celebrated and highly coveted. But if you really dig back and look, Ebel was kind of the case maker and the dial maker and all that kind of stuff for this watch, which I find really interesting. So I would say that I think that the community's ability to like dig deeper into something is definitely something that is much more celebrated. Like, oh, hey, this is the same case maker as Patek, or hey, this is the same maker as, say, this Cartier. And people are definitely becoming more aware and kind of like celebrating that stuff, whereas back in the day, it wasn't really something that was like publicized. Same thing with dials. The Paul Newman dials, if you look at that Paul Newman font, you can find that in Nevada Grenchens, you can find them in Baylors, you can find them in all sorts of different watches, where it wasn't just Rolex that kind of had that configuration. It was other brands that were kind of employing that like lollipop type of marker in their subdials and stuff. So I would say that people are becoming more aware of that and kind of celebrating those things independently. I think smaller watches are definitely trending. I see more people getting into like Rolex bubble backs and kind of celebrating those interesting watches, where 2 years ago, if it wasn't 45 millimeters, people had no interest in it.
You could put it on them. Yep.
Yeah. And I think the independence is definitely something too. People are starting to celebrate more of the independence. Like one of my favorite more modern watch brands, I mean, I'm not just a vintage guy, I love horology and watches through and through, is Trilobe watches. I think that they offer a really interesting watch at a very affordable price point. In-house movement, really interesting dials, really interesting dial and complication layout. And really those watches aren't that expensive compared to, say, like a Journe or something like that has a little bit more of a marquee type of brand behind it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'd be curious if you could kind of touch on restoring a vintage watch. I mean, obviously, I know you get a watch and it's probably 9 out of 10 times not retail ready. So talk about some of those challenges you guys face when you find a watch in, let's just say, a corner market in Japan versus getting it back to the States, and then obviously I'm sure everything gets inspected, and then you get it serviced, or make sure there's no dry oils, or because obviously you're taking a vintage piece of art, right? And
Totally.
And bringing it to modern form in a way, so it can be worn by the modern man. I'd be curious to get your take on what that process is like and how involved that is.
I would say like 99.9% of the verification happens at the time of purchase. And I'm probably able to do that a lot differently than, say, the average person, because I'm doing it so much. So when I'm, inspecting a watch, like say in the middle of nowhere, I'm looking at the serial. I typically will bring a case back opener. I'm looking at the movement. I'm looking at the dial. I'm using all these kind of tools to verify. But when we get the watch, say, back into the office, one of the first things that we do is we need to just kind of, clean the watch. In some cases, we're finding these watches and they have like 25 years of like arm funk on them. And it's just, like, I don't want to
Nothing
send,
like it, man.
yeah, I don't want to send a watch off with like, funk in the bracelet. So that's the first thing. In many cases too, especially in Japan and Hong Kong, the quality of the watches and the care that they've kind of received over their life is a lot different than what we would find here in the US. In many cases, the watches are very well respected and lightly worn. I would say that that's one of the biggest things about finding stuff outside of the US is, and or anywhere. I mean, it kind of just depends, but I would say the condition of things is generally a little bit higher. As it relates to restoring the watch, we don't really do any kind of, restoration to like the dial or the components of the watch. Because in our world, originality and that is definitely favored and is something that is, looked at and cared for. So that's something for us that we're not doing. I'm not, replacing hands or anything like that, or relooming a dial or any of that kind of stuff. That's something that we definitely don't do. But from a technical perspective, if a movement isn't running and if it's not keeping time, then what's the point of wearing it? So in some cases, there is more of like a cleaning of the watch, not necessarily like, the dial or any of that kind of stuff. It's really more of like a mechanical kind of service where we're servicing the movement, making sure that it's running at spec. We use a very tight network of watchmakers and specialists, depending on what it is. In many cases, if it's like really complex and complicated, we're working with the manufacturer. So for example, I had a very interesting Breguet come in, beautiful watch, really interesting reference, but it was complicated. And that's a watch that Breguet is servicing because they have the parts, the components, and the technical engineering on staff at Breguet to in some cases bring that watch back to technical specs so that it actually works. So we're really careful with that kind of stuff, and we pay very close attention to servicing watches and kind of bringing them back up to roadworthiness, if I can say that. I think in some cases it's almost like buying, like, say, an old 911 or an old vintage car. If it's been sitting in the garage for a while, maybe it has a pristine interior and the paint is great and all that kind of stuff, but like, the oil lines are cracking and there's old gas in the tank, and maybe the exhaust is rusted off the car, right? Like you, in some cases, need to bring those things back so that they are roadworthy again. And generally speaking, that's kind of what we do in terms of like bringing these watches back. In some cases too, the watches are in such great condition and we're so particular and peculiar on what we buy, if I can say that, we're really not buying everything that we see. Matter of fact, in some of the videos, we make it look easy, but in that day, say we acquire 10 watches in a day, we've probably looked at like 250, in some cases 500 watches to get to those 10. So we're really buying a very small amount of watches, even though it looks like a lot. We've gone through so many watches. We just posted a video on Instagram talking about buying watches in Japan. And you can see we're flipping through, a ton of watches to buy a very small number. So even though maybe we make it look a little bit easier, it's not something, I'm not like walking into a place and buying 30 watches at a time. We're really buying probably 1% of what we see, maybe more, maybe less, depending on where we're at.
I would be scared of running across the same watches that I've already looked at. I know that you guys have probably more than likely had that before. Where you go to a location that you've been to before, and then you see this watch out in the public again. That would be one of my worries. But I know that we've been talking about the past. On to another tangent. We've been talking about the past. What are some of the future plans for Craft and Tailored? And are you guys, do you have any exciting developments that are in the near future? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, for sure. We have a couple of really interesting collaborations coming up where we're creating watches that are modern and new, that kind of take inspiration and homage from the past. Getting ready to go to Watches and Wonders in Geneva. I'm really excited about that because Watches and Wonders is, for me, a really cool thing. I like that. It's kind of this big event, everybody's excited about it. There's all these companies that are releasing new things. So I'm getting ready for that. And I think like the thing that I want to do is use our vehicles, whether it's social media or website or a journal or whatever, to educate and inform people and kind of use that as a tool to spread awareness to all things watches. But we kind of have this saying, that is kind of stuck with us. It's more than just watches. So I think there's other things that kind of spin off of, watches, whether it's automotive stuff or architecture or design. I find that watches are a connecting point for a lot of other things. And that's something that we're kind of interested in. I think like talking with a collector or a friend or somebody that is a watch enthusiast and also learning about them is something that is of interest to me. So I think we're going to kind of lean into that a little bit more. There's definitely going to be more travel guides as we go to different areas of the world throughout the year. We're going to be trying to curate these little guides and little things to aid the collector community, to find these great places. And we work really hard to find these spots and put a lot of like sweat equity into traveling and doing that stuff. Matter of fact, there's this really interesting guy in Hong Kong. His name is Raymond, and he has like you can check out the videos, but he has what I think is probably one of the smallest watch shops in the world. It's like literally this like stall on Pottinger Street in central Hong Kong. You would probably walk past it a million times, not even notice it. And also it's like on the street. So you're like, what are these watches? Are they good or whatever? The dude is a wealth of information and knowledge. His watches are awesome. He doesn't have the biggest selection in the world, but it's very tasteful. It's very curated. I actually bought a watch from him the last time I was in Hong Kong. And it's cool because I get DMs from people that are like, hey, I saw Raymond today. I bought a watch from him. And Raymond has like no internet, no cell phone, no website, no Instagram, none of this stuff. So for me to like have this like cool experience and to share that with people and drive people to this kind of small dude in the middle of nowhere is really cool. And so I want to do more of that kind of stuff where, people are coming into these places and they want to know where to go, kind of in a selfish way. I didn't have that, and I had to kind of hunt this stuff out. So if I can bring awareness to that, that would be really cool, and kind of cultivate the community a bit more, and help facilitate that stuff. That's definitely something that is kind of always in the back of our head as we create videos and more content and do collaborations and that kind of stuff for sure.
That that brings us like right into the next question. I mean, obviously building that community is very important to what we do, selling watches, or in your case selling watches, and me in my case educating people. um our outlet has been more community focused than it has been product focused, and you see a lot of other outlets out there that are product focused, and we try to shy away from being that outlet. um, but how do you see yourself kind of progressing the brand through the community and continuing to produce quality content that people enjoy? Um, and just again to kind of hammer a little bit more home there is, my friend's going to Japan in a week, and he's like, "Hey, where should I go?" And I'm like, "Dude, I've never been to Japan, but here's a great article." And then of course I I sent him the link to your article. Um, and just I just again kind of want to like thank you for being so transparent, with what you do,
Yeah.
because these are things that nobody else does. And you look at other vintage dealers out there. I'm sure you probably know who I'm talking about. One of the most popular Instagram vintage dealer, besides yourself. They don't talk about that. They're just like, hey, I'm in Tokyo and I bought this watch, and like they never. It's like they're not giving their references. It's like they're citing something, but they're not giving references, which is very important from the academia perspective, right? So,
Yeah, I think there's two sides of that. One, at our level, right? If we're working with, say, like a big dealer in Japan, there are customs and traditions that have to be respected, and also there, I'm going in there knowing what I'm buying and leveraging tenure and expertise in the business to do that. And some of these places are not set up to work with, say, like the retail type of customer. So I can't really I'm not gatekeeping that. I'm ultimately having to pay respect to the business in itself and not overwhelm some of these sources with, you know, like they just can't handle DMs or like, hey, I'm buying one watch or whatever. So there is an element of the business that I have to maintain and be respectful of. But I think to your point, there maybe sometimes is gatekeeping. And for me, I'm not like, if somebody goes to Raymond or one of the shops that we've mentioned in Paris and they buy their first watch and that was a great experience for them, that really makes me happy because um, I want to facilitate good things within the business and within the community in the culture. And I really find value in that. I'm not worried about another dealer selling a watch. I'm worried about that person having a good experience and having a good transaction and really facilitating kind of good vibes and good energy within the watch community. There's a really cool and fun dealer in Paris. His Instagram is Archie Watch, and he had like this little Instagram post that was like, you know, it's like I love like the supportive watch community, right? And that's kind of what this is about for me. I want to, create good vibes and good juju in the watch community because there's enough gatekeeping, there's enough BS, there's enough risk. Like, why add more to that, right? Why not be helpful? Why not share where we're going, right? And I think the thing like with the guides is, I've been to those places. I know what's there. I know what types of watches they have. I know how they transact. And if I can facilitate a good transaction, I think that in some way or form kind of just comes back to the community as a whole. So why not invest into that? I value transparency. I think like we're doing this amazing stuff. We're in these great parts of the world or whatever it is. Why not show that stuff? I think there's been a good number of feedback where people have questioned why we're doing that. And I think for me, the feedback from the community as a whole has been really positive. And I think people are interested in that. I noticed that when we do some of these guides and when these videos, people like bookmark that stuff a lot. And I think that's with the intent of like referring back to it as they're in these places, or if we publish an article that has information on it that is maybe more, if I can say like educational, people will find value in that, and I find value in that stuff too. I'm always bookmarking stuff and trying to kind of archive that stuff for myself too. So I felt like in order to maintain that side, that's part of the reason why we are looking to create that content and be more approachable and open. Granted, when we're getting 100 DMs in a day, sometimes it takes me a while to get through all that stuff. And there's also a side of the internet that is not very respectful. They don't really respect our time or whatever. And it's like price. Yeah. I kind of relate to some of those dealers who get burnt out with that, where it's like price, or they're just kind of, there's no like, ethics or politeness in some cases. I don't take that stuff personal, but we try to, position ourselves as a facilitator, an educator, and somebody who is creating awareness around these things instead of just gatekeeping it. Because I think for me personally, I want to embrace and support the watch community, and I think people should support one another, even if their opinions are different, even if you like this and I like that. Maybe we're both talking about something that's in a way similar, right? So why not support each other, even though the opinion is different, instead of just, crap all over each other. I just think that's just, there's enough of that out there. I'll leave that for the other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's what attracted me to you. And of course, going back to the beginning of a podcast where we talked about the video and you could just tell, I've done a lot of trade shows recently.
Mm-hmm.
And something that I did to step out of the box is like I just got back from Geneva in January, and
Yeah,
I could
I
have
was following along with your trip.
sweet. I kind of wanted to step outside of the press circle because Geneva, especially from a reporter's perspective, like press, like we just become like in queue where people are just lining up and they have these little like, these little talking points, the boom, 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 they just hammer off and they give people the same press. So
Right.
something that we thought about was like, let's just go to Geneva early, you know, um, and get the Watches and Wonders stuff, kind of packed down before Watches and Wonders. We again, I've talked about this. We're not product focused. We're community focused. Like everything that you read from us comes from a communal perspective, like, hey, how to travel with watches, or hey, I did a video on how to buy watches in Istanbul, how to safely choose an AD, and how to negotiate with an AD. I mean, and these
Yeah.
are all things that community and collectors, they don't have resources on. So very similar to you, um, but I'm very curious to see, or maybe if you could paint a perfect picture of Craft and Tailored in 10 years, what would that picture look like? And we will leave you with that one.
Oh, man, that's a good question. I'm going to try to figure that out. I think there's a lot of people that get busy thinking about things, and I'm a guy that just gets busy doing things. I don't want to say that like I don't have a plan or whatever, because I think we definitely do, but in many cases, like a lot of what we do comes from just getting out there and doing it. And if that can be an inspiration for somebody, whether it be watches or travel or whatever, I think that that's something that I would find rewarding. I oftentimes feel kind of like the odd duck because I'm just going out there and doing this stuff. And people are like, wow, you really did that. And I'm like, yeah, for me, that's normal, right? I'm just going out and doing it. I think as it relates to Craft and Tailored as a business, I think, I don't want to say that I'm satisfied, but I'm not also not satisfied with where we're at either. I think if we can facilitate a better community and we can have a part in doing that, then that's something that's very important to me. I think, I mean, maybe it makes sense for us to have another location. We've got a beautiful showroom here in Los Angeles, and the watch community in LA is kind of small. In California in general, there's only a few of us dealers on both the modern side and the vintage side. I think maybe, in 10 years, I don't know. I hope I'm still alive. I drive fast sometimes. So,
I would love to see from Craft and Tailored a Netflix series.
oh man.
like
Like a
of you,
docu-series.
yeah, like of you like just traveling around, kind of like Rick Steves or something, but you hunting vintage watches. But then if you think about it, kind of like a cocktail of like Storage Wars, type of vibes.
Sure.
Like that would be epic, and I would definitely watch every
I
episode.
would too.
Well, if you know
Write
anybody
that
over
down,
at
Cam.
Netflix, yeah, I think that could be fun. I think that we're kind of in a way doing some of that, right? I think the world we live in is interesting because we're doing a lot of long form content where the episodes would be on like a specific watch and they'd be like 3 to 5 minutes long. Obviously, short form content is kind of dominating the space right now, and I even feel like in some cases that I need kind of like the information packaged in a way that's consumable, but also I definitely haven't lost sight of creating more long form content. There's a lot of guys that'll reach out, guys, gals, everybody that wants us to do more long form content and maybe do a deeper dive into the references. We've thought about maybe doing something maybe like Bourdain style, where in many cases we're out there in the middle of nowhere doing this stuff, and I think we're trying as best as we can to share that with everybody. But also at the same time, it's hard for me in some cases to do that because it's like me and one other person, and I'm also trying to buy watches and make sure that I'm doing that part right, and
Yeah.
also trying to find the cool dim sum shop in Hong Kong, or the cool yakitori spot in Japan, and kind of share this stuff. I think that's part of the reason why some of the guides and some of that stuff has done so well for us, is because we're in these countries and in these places and really doing this stuff. So we're speaking from a perspective of experience and having been there. And I think that that's also the difference. I would definitely like to see us maybe create some content around, like traveling. Maybe it's not just about watches, but maybe it's about all the
Yeah.
other great things that we're experiencing when we're doing this stuff. And I think, the travel in some cases can be really rough, right? You're seeing the internet, and everybody's seeing kind of just like the top layer, just the cream, right? It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
oh,
Yeah.
this is so cool. And it's not like shit, flight delay, or, you know, T8
That
typhoon coming through Hong Kong and we're locked in the hotel for 3 days and the building is shaking. Like, we're not really sharing that stuff. But I also think like that could be interesting to talk about that. I don't know if we're Netflix worthy, but I appreciate that. And, that would be something that would be really fun for us. And I'm a pretty open and accessible dude. I don't, share everything, but I think that that's kind of the fun thing too. And if I and or we as a community can inspire more people to do fun or interesting things, I think that would be a big success for me and a win.
yeah, I think the behind the scenes is very interesting for my perspective, and I'm sure a lot of other people's perspectives. Because let's just say, for example, they realize what you went through to find that one watch, or maybe bring that, and then when you bring that watch home, let's just say, for example, like you had some event that happened or something, like where, who knows, right? Somebody may relate to what you had to go through to acquire that watch, and then entail creating an immediate bond with that watch that you found. Like, let's just say you found a vintage watch that you found at an estate, and it was passed down. It was like a grandpa who, like he didn't have anybody to give his collection to, or and then it ended up at an estate sale, and then you got your hands on it, and then let's just say there's a collector out there that had the exact same Patek or exact
Yeah.
same Rolex, and they weren't able to acquire that from their grandpa, for whatever reason, right? I mean, just similar circumstances, people can build their own connection with your products, and so
Yeah. I think that could
that
be really fun and cool for sure. I mean, we definitely have enough travel on the schedule. Last year, I did 450,000 miles in the air. That's a lot of
wow.
butt time in the seat.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
sponsor me, American Airlines. But
yeah.
but I think we're definitely trying to figure out a way to bring more access to that type of stuff, and figuring out how to do that from a technical perspective and bring in the right people that can kind of capture that. Because people would say, oh, Cam is a content creator, Cam is a dealer, Cam is a news resource, he's a collector. I think in a weird way I'm kind of all those things, which is hard for the industry to kind of like compartmentalize, right? Because people like to put things into like these like edible, consumable, justifiable things. And I'm kind of in a weird way all those things. I think craft and tailored as a whole is in a way an extension of the things that I have passions with, and but also at the same time, like we're really out there, we're really doing it. I'm really wearing it. I'm really driving it. I'm really going to these places. It's not just kind of internet fluff, so to speak. And I think that is something that I want to use to, again, kind of give back to the community, and maybe facilitate inspiration in people, or maybe even brands and stuff like that. I think, a lot of the watch brands today are kind of lost. I think Cartier is doing a great job of looking at their archive. I think Rolex is starting to do that a little bit. I think maybe even Patek, right? So we're seeing these brands kind of pay homage in a modern way to their heritage. And if I can be a facilitator to that, that would also be really cool, right? So yeah, I think there's a ton of opportunity for us. I think we're growing sometimes faster than I like, because it can be a little bit overwhelming. But it's been a great ride, a great journey, and it's doing stuff like this that I really love and really enjoy. So thanks for having me, guys. I really appreciate this, and
Yeah.
be a part of the pod.
Of
Yeah,
course,
yeah.
man.
Thanks for coming on. I know it was really crazy going back and forth for a long time. We like to give our outlet to our guests, so we did touch through a lot here. Is there anything that maybe we didn't talk about, or that we didn't touch on, that maybe you would like to. You have the floor entirely to yourself now.
Yeah, I mean, we talked a
Um,
lot about me and craft and tailored. I think I kind of want, like, what are you excited about, Blake? What are you excited about, Justin? What are you looking forward to, maybe from Watches and Wonders? What are you looking forward to? You know, is there something that you're chasing? I'm kind of interested to hear what you guys are interested in. And Blake, you have a really cool collection. I think you have a diverse collection as well. You've got modern stuff, you've got vintage stuff, you've got expensive stuff, you've got accessible stuff.
yeah,
I mean, you're really a true collector, which is something I relate to, because I'm the same way with my watches. I have swatches. I have a friend of mine recently gifted me this Leica swatch, which is like so cool because I'm a Leica
yeah.
collector, and I love that watch. So I want to maybe ask you guys questions. What are you excited about? What's on the horizon for you?
Does it have the little red dot? Is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah,
Yeah, love that. We're camera guys, so we know.
So so yeah,
yeah,
we there's a lot of overlap for us because we both come from the camera world. Like Justin and I both worked as Canon vendors, and we've kind of grown up together. Regarding Watches and Wonders, I really don't know, and so I tell my wife like, I hope they don't release cool shit because then I want to buy it, you know. So, um, but I go on the record a lot and I talk about how I like to see brands experimenting, kind of like what you said with materials and shapes and form. And I think that's what resonates so much with me with Cartier because they are a jewelry, like a high fashion jewelry company, so they can work with shapes and materials that nobody else can really.
yeah,
Um, if you look at our outlet, we are starting to kind of go backwards, but we're also going forwards at the same time. Because if you look at our podcast outlet, like, we're working with a lot of micro brands, right? But if you look at our website, we're working with a lot of big brands. Like I've got access to Patek and Omega and Hublot and all this stuff. So we're kind of like going forwards and we're coming from two angles and we're meeting here in the center, like right now. And we're starting getting ready to bring bigger brands on the podcast. I'm not going to say who, but um, I going back, I just want to see the community grow. I want to see a transparent watch community. I want to see new people getting into the hobby. I want to see like a supportive watch community because this community can be very, very, very toxic, but it can also be very, very, very supportive.
totally.
Um, and so if I had a perfect world, it would be that. And that's kind of the reason why Lonely Wrist exists. Because I liked being in the community. I liked talking about watches. I liked being that resource, but I hated the process of doing it because when you're selling watches, I don't know if you know, but I came from an AD, so I came
Yeah,
from that suit and tie retail environment.
yeah,
Um, and it feels like a very sterile experience, and there's also a shady aspect of it, like where people were coming in for certain watches that we had, but we pretended that we didn't have, you know. Um,
well, I
so
think that's an interesting facet, and not to interrupt you, but I think the
of
one
course,
thing that I like, it's funny, right? Because you have this collector side or whatever you want to call it, which is like, oh, did you get that at retail? Well, how much did you pay for it? And I'm like, what does that have to do with
What does it matter?
anything, right? Like that collector kind of acquisition dynamic really took a shift where it was like, well, do you even like the watch, or did you just buy it because it was available and at retail? Regardless of what it is. And I think that's something I don't deal with a lot because we're more on the vintage side of the fence, where it's
yeah,
like, okay, great, we have this watch and it's one of two available in the entire world, right? And I like that element of it as well. I'm not saying that I'm not a modern watch guy. Like, I think the new ceramic Daytona white dial, it's a grail watch for me, right? But to pay $36,000 for one, there's so many other things I'd rather acquire that I think would give
Yeah,
me a better sense of exclusivity. If I could get one at retail, awesome. Like, let's do it. Um, but I think and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's fine. I don't really have an opinion on that, right? But I think the collector mentality kind of changed to where it wasn't really about the watches anymore. It was about like the hype behind some of these things. And
yeah,
I'll say this: I don't really think it was necessarily the brands themselves doing this. I think it was kind of the market that did this to itself. I mean, it was kind of
it is.
it's the community, and I fortunately don't deal with that side of the community a lot because I deal with true enthusiasts and collectors. But to your point, like, where's the passion? Where's the where's the excitement with these things versus just like, what'd you pay? I'm
Yeah,
like, I don't know. I
and
could show you 15 other watches that are like half the price of whatever it is that you're showing me, that are much more horologically interesting and much more significant and just as cool. And they're not $150,000. You know,
now now that, and I've said this on the record too, like, I mean, people who watch me on YouTube, like, I go on and stream a lot with a lot of other YouTubers, and I've
yeah,
said this publicly, but now that the brands, essentially the COVID pushed the hype up, right, for whatever watch, right, Daytona, Submariner, whatever, OPs, um, so the brands got used to that, and then their business model has been to maintain the hype, not to produce the hype, right? So you see brands like Rolex or Patek, or, I mean, not so much Longa anymore, or Vacheron, because those brands are kind of falling away from the hype. But Rolex does a great job at it. Patek does an amazing job at it. But they're keeping the hype up. They're maintaining it. They're propping it up by creating this surplus. I mean, especially if you look at the retail Rolex distribution model, where there is 2 million watches produced a year. Don't quote me on the number, but and then there's 3,300 retail partners, right? Like, where do the watches go? They end up at on Chrono 24, or on eBay, or at a premium, or at some gray market dealer, or whatever, like, um so, but the thing that I do believe is that now that this hype has, like, this hype has pushed the market there, I don't think brands like Rolex or Patek or AP are gonna let those hype pillars fall. Like, they're gonna continue to hold the hype weapon, um, and they're doing it by the artificial surplus. I think, because I know what was in our safe. When I worked at a retailer, and it was crazy. Um, and that was, again, part of the reason why it just wasn't for me, because I take pride in being honest and transparent, and a pillar, a beacon in this community. I'm trying to be known as that. Where I'm not going to give you the fluff. I'm not going to give you the bullshit. Um, and I just couldn't continue down that path, um, without. I felt like I was losing my integrity. You know.
yeah.
Um,
I think I think that's the thing that I love about CNT, and maybe kind of the position that we hold. And again, we don't really deal with a lot of modern watches. I
yeah,
think I
that's probably
think
in your best interest.
Yeah, I think we're just dealing with the collectors and the consumers, and a lot of my clients and a lot of our the guys that we work with, guys and gals, they have a diverse collection, right? It's not just all modern Rolex. It's not just all Grail level Patek. I think that variety is the spice of life, and I think most of the people that I work with and what we do from a content perspective is very informative. We'll that's my ultimate goal. I try to stay out of the politics a little bit because, one, I can't control them, and also, like, there's so much more interesting stuff too. Like, I
Yeah,
love discovering new things that maybe somebody didn't consider, and that's really fun and interesting. But I think the common theme for sure is that you know, there's an element of the community that is very supportive and very much uplifting to the collectors themselves. And I think that that's something that's really important to me, right? Regardless of where you're at in your collecting level or what you have in the collection, you know, I think that that's something that I want to perpetuate within what we do as a dealer. Granted, we are definitely more on the vintage side and that kind of stuff, but I think that, you know, that's the other great thing. There's so many different facets to our community with the independence and, you know, with all that stuff. There's so many flavors, right? And at the end of the
Yeah.
day, it might all be a form of ice cream, but there's like an unlimited number of flavors that makes this so cool and rewarding and interesting.
Something that I noticed too, and if you look at some of my other projects, so we have obviously Lonely Wrist, and then we have the Vegas Watch Society, which
Yep.
was kind of appointed to me by another community, and there hadn't been a Vegas Red Bar for a while, so we saw an opportunity. Um, and then if you notice about watch collecting, you see people that have a lot of money, and you see people that are one watch collectors that dream to have just a Rolex. You know, it doesn't matter what Rolex it is, or just to have an Omega or something. So in the watch community, you have people that are, you know, just trying to get by, and then you have these ultra high worth people. But then you find yourself you find that this community segments even further by how much money you have. So the Patek collectors will stick together. The the Rolex Patek AP, the Longa guys will all be like, okay, here we are, and then the one guy with a Citizen that does hundreds of hours worth of research every week trying to learn about new like watches, technology, innovations. I mean, why is there such a segmented collector? Like, we're already like a small percentage of collectors. Like, there's so many other different types of collecting, like hobbyists that collect different things. Like, watches is not a top collected item. So that goes back to the Vegas Watch Society, trying to bridge the gap of just the one citizen guy who loves watches to the guy. Like, we had an event March 9th, I think, and there was one guy that had a Citizen, or like just a Seiko 5 or whatever, and he was super passionate about watches, but he felt like he didn't have the place to be at our watch community because he didn't have a Rolex, or because he didn't have a Patek or whatever. But then we had a collector that flew in from California, and he had a day date with a mother of pearl dial, the diamond indices, and it was a Rolex masterpiece with the Creedor, right? The yellow gold, rose gold, and the white gold.
Yeah, the
Um,
Tridor watch. Yeah, that's
yeah,
cool.
Tridor. Sorry, yeah. And so he was passing it around. There was maybe 70 people there, and he was
Yeah.
passing this watch around. Um, so just giving somebody that space, giving somebody that community is probably the most important thing for me, for Lonely Wrist. Um,
I
and
think that's really awesome, and the fact that you're able to facilitate that, and maybe bring the guy in that is kind of just starting, but maybe he got to like feel the Tridor for the first time or experience
yeah,
it. Like that's something I think that is really important. We have a showroom here in LA, and the thing that I love doing is bringing people in and just having kind of a watch hang. And I think the other thing too is that we are so internet based that in many cases, like, we're looking at these images online, but when you feel and experience some of these things for the first time, it can kind of change your perspective, in some cases for the better or for the worse. It's like, you know for example, I would say platinum is probably not my top metal for watches,
yeah,
just because it's so heavy,
yeah,
but I
yeah,
love the way that platinum looks, right? It has kind of this
yeah.
not white gold. It's kind of its own thing.
Like
But I
shimmer.
didn't really understand until later in my collecting that, like, I can't wear platinum because it's not functional. It's so heavy. It depends on its format or whatever.
Right.
But yeah, right. Experiencing that and like feeling stuff is so cool. And to your point, for the Vegas Watch Society, to be able to facilitate that stuff, I think is so important. And I would encourage people to get involved in that, even if you have a Citizen. Like, I mean, there are a couple of jerks out there for sure. There's always a bad apple in a bushel, right? But generally speaking, I
Right.
think for the most part, the watch community has been kind of cool and kind of welcoming for the most part, right? There's always again a bad apple for every bunch, but um, yeah, and I think to be able to pull that together, Blake, I think is really cool, especially in an area like Vegas because it's such an interesting community. We were out there together with Rob Report during F1, and what a crazy place! Like Vegas is
Right.
really cool, and in a way for the locals that I think is also really different because I come in and out of Vegas. I come for watch shows or events or whatever. I don't live there, but the people that live there are really interesting and cool people.
Yeah.
And the watch community, I'm sure there is also equally as cool and interesting.
I haven't seen much of it, and that was surprising by our first event because like of course the way that I tried to grow the community was through my friends in retail. Like, hey, like if you have a few customers that are locals that are super watch nerds, like connect me with them. Like I would love to meet them, and I see a lot of people that come and go out of Vegas, but here the locals we kind of stay out of the scene, because
Mhm.
it's really easy for you to get caught up in, whether it's gambling or other toxins here, right? So, um, the community is very different, and so yeah, I felt like it was really challenging for me to kind of unearth this community, and I have no idea why the local Red Bar community stopped doing Vegas. Maybe it's just the leadership didn't get passed over or whatever. Um, and it felt like there's this huge gap. And I had heard people that said like, "Hey, like, don't start this in Vegas. Like, this is gonna there's just not enough demand for it, or people are so hard to get organized or whatever." I just got a lot of kind of like pushback and a lot of like constructive feedback that was telling me to not do it, but that just made me want to do it more. And then the fact that we had such a large event and we had a company like Bucherer, which is arguably, I mean, not arguably, but the biggest watch retailer in the world. Because when I approached them, I was like, "Hey, um, I want to start a watch community in Vegas, and I don't have a community, but I want to start it, and I want your help." And they were like, "Yeah, yeah, let's do it." It was that natural, and I was like, "Holy shit!" Like I thought that they would just like laugh me out of the building, because I told them I was like, "Look, I don't know how many people are going to show up. I'm going to do an RSVP. I'm going to make sure we keep records of people who are coming, like what type of collectors they are, to get some information about them, so we know that we're having like a good mix of enthusiasts." And and it literally started off with all of my retail partner friends were like, "Yeah, dude, I'll help you. I'll help you. I'll help you. I'll help you." But then it just became like crickets. Like nobody helped me. Zero people helped me. So there I am, like up until the last minute. Like, of course, I had almost like 45 or 50 people that RSVP'd. Um, and I was like, "Oh shit! Like, what if no? Like, there's a thought in my mind where I got to Bucherer and there was nobody there. It was just an empty showroom, and I was like, "Shit! Am I gonna be the only person, like me and my 5 friends that flew in?" And here I am, like they're flying in. I'm promising them that this is gonna be an amazing watch show, and like there was always that doubt in my mind. Um, but at the end of the day, my friends were like, "Dude, this is just for them. It's not for anybody else. So if people don't see that there's a community here that's for them, then yeah, it's their loss." But ended up being an amazing show. We're doing another one on the 12th, which is April 12th, and it's just gonna be like low pressure. Like we're just gonna do like maybe at a bar, like a little poorhouse where you can go weigh your own beers out.
Oh,
Um,
that's cool.
and then I'm also working on a few other larger events. So, our goal is to have at least 2 to 3 large events a year. And when I say large, I mean a couple hundred people if we can pull it together. Um, and then just, maybe the 10, 20, or 15 guys that are just like, grabbing beers, showing off their newest watches or whatever.
Yeah, having a
Um,
hang.
and then bringing exposure, I think, to the Vegas scene that is nearly impossible to do, but showcasing there's so many great watch brands out there. Like when we
Yeah,
went to Atlanta, like Justin and I just came back from Atlanta like yesterday, like the day before. And we were at a watch show with 17 different brands, and they're all amazing watch brands in their own light. But not a lot of people get the opportunity to buy them or to get hands on with them, should I say? Because there's this paralysis that goes in where you see a watch on the internet and you know it. It's probably the most challenging thing as an internet watch dealer. Is creating an accurate picture of the product you're selling. So,
yeah, for
um,
sure.
and especially vintage, that's like impossible to do. But
Yeah, it's
but
tricky
but
sometimes for sure.
there's so many brands out there that people will never get the opportunity to buy or to own or to get hands on with because they don't have the distribution. They don't like, it wasn't until 2 years ago that Oris, like a huge brand in the watch industry, they didn't have a retail partner in Vegas. That's so
That's
weird.
crazy. Yeah,
you know so I am talking and working on um bringing something like that to Vegas, like helping to curate a collection of brands because everybody comes to Vegas.
yeah,
So the challenge is what will get people off the strip and into my part of Vegas, like Henderson or
yeah.
Summerlin. um to see these brands, like what brands excite people enough to get them to take an Uber 20 minutes away, 15 minutes away from the strip to see this watch. um and that is the question that I have the answers, but I'm working to try and do so.
That's awesome, man. Well, it's going to be fun seeing that grow, and I'm sure I'll be following along with
You
social, and we have some
Yeah.
Vegas stuff. I think coming up. There's I think the show. Sometimes I kind of forget like what we're doing because I'm like, okay, here's what I have for the day, and then like, okay, great, we're getting on the airplane, and then doing that kind of thing. But I think for the antique show, we definitely go. I think every year. I think there's like a smaller like jewelry show. It's like an IWJG or something, and then the big antique show. They do the Vegas one, and then they do Boss Miami, original Miami Beach Antique Show. So generally, those shows will definitely be at. And when we're in town, we gotta get together. We'll do a dinner or something. It'd be great to catch up with
Yeah.
you guys.
I already have my pass for the vintage watch show, which is May 30th to June 2nd. It's during that same time as Couture, which is the
Yeah.
antique one. Um,
Yep.
I definitely would love to see you at that one. Um, and I think also in the future too, we've done some trader spotlights, if I can call you a
Okay.
trader. Um,
Sure.
and and I would love to, work on something like that with you in the future.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Um, maybe follow you around with some cameras, and if you're down, let me tag along
Yeah.
to Hong Kong or Japan or whatever, and I would be that third perspective where I'm not going to take away from your mission, which is to go out there and to acquire products, but just to document the odd things that you guys don't have time to.
You're
Yeah.
just
No,
trying to
that's
start that Netflix series.
I am trying to start a Netflix series.
Blake's like I want those. I want that those Netflix publishing producer rights. I got to get in there early.
I'm working on it, man. Give me the opportunity.
I'm
Um,
down, man.
but no, I mean, it's just what you're doing is amazing. And I told Justin before
For
you
sure.
came on that this was. I mean, I hope that a lot of the people who come on the podcast don't hear this part, um, but I was definitely probably most excited for this one,
Oh, thanks,
because
man.
you're
I really appreciate that.
He was fangirling just a little bit.
I was like, man, this is a big one. This is great. I was hyping it up to Justin because Justin was like, oh, I don't know, whatever, it's another podcast.
Like we'll kill it, man.
But
Either way, great show.
but there's so much alignment between what we do and what you do. And anytime, for example, I'm sure you probably see, but anytime you guys have a crazy unique watch, like I always repost it on my social to try and create some awareness and help you guys, get out there.
Yeah, I
And
really
so yeah,
appreciate that. And I think for me too, as we grow, I don't know if I like, I never thought Craft and Taylor would be like this. I never thought that, like, I was coming back from Japan. It's like the weirdest thing. I like sit down on my seat and I like look over and the guy that's like across from me is like scrolling watches, and then he like looks at me and he's like, "Oh, like I just saw your Japan video," and I'm like, "Yeah, I'm here in Japan." And so we had like this conversation. He was this really cool tutor, and we just started like talking watches. And then this was like a weird thing. I was like on the same leg. I was like transferring trains in Dallas or something, going to a different terminal, and I step onto this train and this guy's like, Cam, and I'm like, hey, and he ended up being a client that I had never met before, who was an international client traveling. And so that was really cool because it was the first time that we had met, because we had been DMing and he bought watches from us, and there was kind of like that virtual connection. But it was like cool meeting this guy in a train of all places, right? Just through happenstance. So I never thought that we would be here. I don't know where we're going to end up, but I think the fun thing is that I don't really care how big or how large this gets. The community is the most important thing for me, and giving people access and showing people what we're doing, I think, is the most important thing for us. So yeah, man, I appreciate the opportunity to be on the pod. I really like what you guys are doing, and we had a great time in Vegas when we were doing stuff for Robert Port. So
we
I know
did.
we were talking about it then, but
Yeah,
yeah,
we didn't have as much time then to clack down like a 2 hour pod, but no, it was an honor to be on the same panel as you for sure, and for you to come on our podcast. And
yeah, man, my
I,
pleasure.
I've been a fan for years, and we're forever fans. So yeah, we will always support you in any way that we can. From us here at Lonely Resident and
I
Vegas Watch
really appreciate
Society
that,
and
guys. Yeah, no,
any
this
of
has
that.
been
Of course.
an honor and a super fun pod. Thanks for having me, for sure.
Thanks as
Yeah,
well, Cam.
yeah. Well, thanks. We're cracking here 2 hours now. That we always have an epic one every once in a while. And so yeah, I'm glad that you came on, and we will definitely be watching, and we'll definitely stay in touch for sure.
Blake, Justin, thanks again for having me, guys. It's been an honor. Can't wait to hear myself speak.
Yeah,
But yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. I really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch. I'll see you guys. I'll see you guys in Vegas.
yeah. You're welcome.
Sounds
See you,
good,
buddy.
brother.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Bye.